Welcome back to the Archive History Detectives. If you've been riding along with us through the frozen, blood-slicked grid of 1941 Northeast China, you know that our guide through this historical labyrinth, a sharp-witted young military translator named Chung Bao, has just survived an absolute heartstopper. In our last episode, we stood in the cramped, candlelit rooms of a Japanese border inn where a paranoid, razor-thin Japanese general and a towering opium-addicted Chinese warlord drew their blades and engaged in a terrifying close-quarters standoff right on the Soviet frontier. Fortunately, the blades were sheathed, the alcohol settled, and the high. The command managed to avoid a mutual execution. The Grand Military Inspection Delegation boarded their ironclad flagship, the Yangmin, and began sailing swiftly down the unwinding currents of the Songhua River, leaving the suffocating paranoia of the border post behind. But as the ship glided away from the artillery bunkers, the narrative shifted from military standoffs to something far more insidious, far more corrupt, and deeply intoxicating. Today, we're opening the ledger on Chp.7 of Chung Bao's
A Deathbed Memoirs, an episode he titled A Fuyong and the Allure of Manchurian Cuisine. Now, to an American ear,
the word a Fuyong sounds incredibly elegant, exotic, and beautiful. It rolls off the tongue like the name of a rare, precious orchid blooming in a hidden valley. But the millions of impoverished citizens living under the iron heel of the puppet state of Manchukuo, a Fuyong was the ultimate monster. It was the poetic, classical name for raw. Under fine opium, it was the black tar that dissolved a man's will, drained his life savings, and turned thriving cities into colonies of walking ghosts. For our Western listeners, to understand the geopolitical landscape of Northeast China in 1941, you have to realize that this wasn't just a military occupation, it was a state-sponsored narco-empire. Much like the British Empire that used opium to break the back of the Qing dynasty a century earlier. The Imperial Japanese Army discovered that a population addicted to the pipe was a population that lacked the energy to pick up a rifle and fight back. But in this twisted, upside-down world, vice and survival were deeply entangled. While millions drowned their dataros in the sweet, deadly smoke of the poppy field, the occupiers themselves, isolated, terrified, and freezing in a foreign land, found their ultimate psychological salvation in a completely unexpected place. The rich, fiery, and deeply satisfying flavors of traditional Manchurian cuisine. So, pack your bags, clear your throat. Let's journey down the river to explore a world where a brick of contraband drugs could buy an empire, and a single plate of freshly sliced raw carp could save a man from a firing squad. At exactly 2:00 p.m. on a crisp autumn afternoon, the warship Yangmin rounded a massive bend in the river. And the thriving county seat of Fujian slowly materialized out of the low-hanging horizon. Chung Bao, standing on the observation deck. The visual contrast was absolutely stunning. If the border outpost of Higa was a cold, silent, paranoid military trench, then Fujian was the New Orleans of the Far East. The harbor was an absolute forest of wooden masts, towering iron, chimneys, and tangled rigging. Massive commercial passenger steamers liner pulled from the docks, belching thick columns of black coal smoke into the gray sky. Along the shoreline, an endless, unbroken labyrinth of brick warehouses and commercial trade depots stretched as far as the eye could see. This was the vibrant, chaotic economic heartland where the great Songhua and Amur rivers converged into a sprawling delta of wealth. Here, there were no visible artillery batteries, no tense border guards staring across a river with binoculars. The air didn't smell like gunpowder, it smelled like money, wet lumber, and river salt. The welcoming party waiting on the wooden piers was an absolute spectacle of wartime collaboration. Standing at the front of the line was a formal military reception unit led by a sharp Japanese officer named Commander Zumi, flanked by a full naval honor guard dressed in pristine white uniforms. But the real power on that dock wasn't wearing a uniform. Stepping out from the crowd of onlookers was a small delegation of 5 or 6 local elite elders dressed in luxurious traditional silk robes and flowing Mandarin jackets. Leading them was a man who ran the entire county's underground economy, Yao V. Yao was a towering figure of old world aristocratic prestige, with a brilliant mane of frost-white hair, an elegant, perfectly trimmed silver beard, and the charismatic aura of a classic southern politician. The moment Yao V spotted our towering Chinese warlord commander Admiral Yin the Bearded, his face lit up with an incredibly warm, exaggerated smile. He stepped forward, performed an elaborate old school. A theatrical bow clutched his hands together in respect, and began loudly shouting greetings. My dear brother, Admiral Yin, my old friend, welcome back to Fujin. Showered the old warlord with affection, acting as if he would happily sacrifice his own life just to ensure the admiral had a pleasant stay. Chengbao watched this display with a deeply cynical smile. He knew exactly why Yao V was performing this grand theatrical show of loyalty. In this lawless border territory, a powerful merchant didn't survive by relying on the courts or the law. He survived by purchasing the protection of a man who commanded battleships. That evening, the grand welcoming banquet was held inside Fujin's most luxurious and expensive establishment, a sprawling modern inn known as the Nagoya, to accommodate the massive crowd of over 100 military and civilian elites. The workers had completely removed the thin but the sliding wooden wall panels of the entire first floor, transforming the building into one colossal, echoing dining hall. Inside the room was divided by a stark, invisible color line. On one side sat the local Chinese puppet officers and wealthy merchants. On the other sat the imperial Japanese military brass, drinking heavily and eyeing the locals with quiet contempt. Suddenly, a young, aggressive Japanese aligned infantry captain named Zhang Jiazhen squeezed his way directly into the center of the main VIP head table. Zhang was a local collaborator who spoke Chinese with a thick, rural, northeastern accent, and he loved to brag to anyone who would listen that he was the personal star pupil of the terrifying Japanese Army Chief of Staff, Major General Lin Baoji. General Lin, sitting at the head of the table with his massive 4-foot sword resting against his chair, looked at Chengbao, waved his hand dismissively, and barked in a gruff voice, "Bao, sit down. Don't bother translating for me tonight. It's a waste of precious time." Lin turned entirely to his pet student, Captain Zhang, using him as his personal megaphone for the evening. Emboldened by the alcohol and the presence of his master, General Lin began completely letting loose, loudly pounding his fist on the table and delivering an unhinged, grandiose military rant. He slurred his words, shouting that an all-out apocalyptic war between Japan and the Soviet Union was inevitable and imminent. He dismissed the global power of Great Britain and the United States, arrogance radiating from his eyes as he bragged that Japan's European allies, specifically Nazi Germany, would easily dismantle the Western powers, leaving the River Army to conduct massive, glorious amphibious invasions across the continent. The surrounding Japanese officers ate up the fascist rhetoric. They unbuttoned their stiff wool collars, beat their ceramic sake bowls against the tables in a chaotic rhythm, threw their heads back, and began roaring aggressive imperial military marches. They completely lost their professional composure, aggressively grabbing, fondling, and pulling the terrified local serving girls into their laps in a display of unbridled drunken entitlement. And what about our legendary Chinese commander, Admiral Yin the Bearded? They didn't give a single damn about General Lin's grand geopolitical fantasies. He sat there for a few minutes as face a mask of absolute boredom before quiet quietly slipping out of his seat, exiting the chaotic dining hall, and retreating to the total sanctuary of his private upstairs. And sweet to smoke cigarettes and talk about his old hometown with his trusted inner circle. He knew that the empire was built on hot air, and he had far more important, far more lucrative matters to attend to. The next morning, the grand ideological show of the banquet vanished, replaced by the cold, cutthroat reality of wartime corruption. Early in the afternoon, during a mandatory administrative audit of the fleet's local supply lines, General Lin Baoji called the commander of the warship Dadong, a local Chinese officer named Captain Zhao, into his private office for an emergency interrogation. Cheng Bao stood by the door, acting as the official recorder. General Lin was absolutely red in the face, slamming his ledger onto his desk and repeatedly screaming a very specific, dangerous word at the trembling Captain Opium. Poor Captain. Zhao was shaking so violently that thick beads of sweat were dripping off his chin and staining his military papers. Cheng Bao didn't need a translator to understand exactly what was happening. He realized that Captain Zhang Jiazhen, the snitch from the banquet table, had snuck into General Lin's quarters the previous night to deliver a secret tip-off, revealing that Captain Zhao's warship had been secretly using official military patrols to smuggle massive quantities of raw, illegal black smoke across the province. But here is the ultimate dark irony of the era. Everyone was doing it. To an American audience, think of North Manchuria in 1941 as Chicago during the absolute height of Al Capone's prohibition, but instead of bootleg whiskey, the entire economy ran on black market opium. The territory was absolutely not saturated with tobacco and drug dens, some run illegally by ruthless local triad gangs. And others operated completely out in the open by official corrupt government monopolies. The addiction was so pervasive, so deeply woven into the daily fabric of life, that the locals used to share a hilarious, darkly satirical joke about it. They said that inside the mansions of the wealthy elites, the smoke from the master's opium pipes was so thick, constant, and suffocating that even the house dogs, the pet-tats, and the hidden mice living inside the wooden ceiling beams developed a severe chemical dependency. The story went that one day a local lord took his entire the family out of the city for a week-long holiday, leaving the house completely dark and cold. Without the daily ocean of second-hand opium smoke rising to the ceiling, 3 or 4 local mice suddenly lost their footing, fell off the roof rafters and crashed onto the floorboards, twitching, shaking, dead and going into horrific full-blown chemical withdrawals. When the master finally returned home and witnessed the convulsing rodents, he calmly sat down, lit his massive pipe, took a deep drag, and blew a massive, concentrated cloud of thick white smoke directly onto the dying mice. Within seconds, the rodents sneezed 3 times, instantly flipped back onto their feet, regained their energy, and happily sprinted back into the walls. It was a funny story, but the reality on the streets was a horrific tragedy. Every single morning, Cheng Bao walked past the frozen gutters of Harbin and saw the naked, emaciated corpses of penniless addicts who had spent their final cents on a single puff of the pipe, lying in the snow like abandoned animals. The Japanese rulers intentionally maintained a policy of prohibiting the drug outwardly while promoting it inwardly, systematically using the narcotics trade to fund their secret military operations while destroying the political will of the local population. Yet the hypocrisy ran straight to the top. Every single ship in the river defense fleet, from the high-ranking admirals down to the lowest engine room coal shovelers, was actively involved in the smuggling syndicate. When General Lin Baoji launched his terrifying audit that afternoon, Cheng Bao knew the general wasn't actually angry about the morality of the drug trade. He was angry because the Navy hadn't paid the Army its cut of the profits before the inspection delegation prepared to pack their bags and head to their final destination. Yao V stepped forward once again to smooth things over. He invited Admiral Yin and his top administrative staff to visit his private, fortified luxury estate for a final intimate farewell luncheon. The moment Cheng Bao stepped through the heavy wooden gates of Yao's courtyard, his nostrils were instantly assaulted by the heavy, sweet, unmistakable scent of burning high-grade opium smoke drifting from the back parlor. Admiral Yin was led directly into the private rooms, where he spent 2 hours completely replenishing his physical deficiencies. After days of traveling on a dry military warship, when the old warlord finally emerged to sit down at the banquet table, his face was radiant, flushed with a warm, contented glow, not completely energized by the narcotic luxury to entertain the high command. Yao V proudly introduced his private personal translator, a sharp 23-year-old youth named Komatsu. Komatsu was a child of occupation, mixed race, Eurasian young man born to a Japanese father and a Chinese mother. He dressed in a crisp, pristine Japanese military uniform, but his eyes carried a deep, haunted look of displacement. During the dessert course, Komatsu's beautiful younger sister stepped out onto the floor. She was dressed in an elegant, traditional silk gown, and with a voice as clear and pure as crystal. She began performing The Manchurian Girl, a massive, popular radio hit made famous across Asia by the legendary singer Li Xianglan. Her performance was breathtaking, earning a roaring round of applause and cheers from both the Japanese and Chinese officers in the dock room. But as Cheng Bao watched the beautiful young girl sing, a deep, heavy wave of melancholy washed over his mind. He looked at these mixed-race siblings caught directly between two warring civilizations. They wore the clothes of the occupier, but they spoke the language of the occupied. They secretly hated the violence, fearing the impending day when the massive Soviet armies across the border would launch an invasion. Cheng Bao wondered bitterly, when the real storm breaks and the tanks begin, you roll, where will these children of Sino-Japanese friendship run to hide? They were citizens of an empire built on sand, and the tide was coming in when the luncheon concluded, and the inspection team prepared to board the Yangmin. Yao V's servants loaded a series of massive, heavy wooden crates directly into Admiral Yin's private storage quarters. Stamped onto the side of each wooden box was a bright, colorful commercial logo that read "Premium Sweet Oranges." Okay. Alongside the crates was a massive, beautifully wrapped parcel containing dozens of pounds of fresh, expensive smoked salmon caught from the local delta. When the flagship arrived back in Harbin, weeks later, Admiral Yin would personally distribute several of these boxes of oranges to the top Japanese naval advisors at the base, flashing a generous smile. But Cheng Bao knew the truth. He knew that if you peeled back the top layer of golden, fragrant fruit inside those crates, you wouldn't find citrus. You would find hundreds of pounds of dense black, premium, unrefined opium bricks destined to enrich the retirement funds of the High Command. The empire ran on vice, and business was booming. The final stop of the grand winter inspection tour was Jiamusi, Villorges, most critical commercial shipping hub on the lower stretches of the Songhua River. On a freezing afternoon inside a dark, drafty military warehouse, a bureaucratic nightmare reached its absolute peak. A ruthless, stone-faced Japanese supply officer named Major Shirai was conducting a meticulous audit of the local garrison's inventory. Major Shirai was a tyrannical bureaucrat who took absolute pleasure in terrorizing his subordinates. He had singled out a young local Chinese puppet lieutenant named Lieutenant Chow, accusing him of a minor clerical error in the logistics ledger. Major Shirai forced the young lieutenant to stand in the freezing cold warehouse for hours, manually counting every single pair of heavy leather military boots in inventory one by one, Lieutenant Chow was paralyzed with fear. His hands shaking so violently as he turned the pages that thick, drops of anxiety sweat were literally falling off his forehead and splattering onto the official record books. If Major Shirai found a single missing pair of boots, it would just mean a demotion. It would mean a trip to the Gendarmerie prison camp under suspicion of stealing Imperial supplies for the resistance. Right as the tension inside the warehouse reached a suffocating, lethal breaking point, a young boy wearing a stained apron from a local restaurant burst through the heavy doors. He bowed frantically to the officers and shouted, "Sirs, drop the pens. The grand banquet tables have been set at the tavern. Lunch is served." The moment General Lin Baoji heard the words, "Manchurian cuisine," his eyes lit up with a ravenous wild hunger. He slammed his audit book shut, threw his pencil onto the table, and roared at the top of his lungs, "Excellent drop. Everything immediately. We eat now, and we can finish this miserable paperwork this afternoon. Move out." The transformation inside the Japanese officer corps was instantaneous and hilarious. The cold, terrifying Imperial masters vanished, replaced by a pack of starving wolves. They dropped their ledgers, abandoned their investigations, and swarmed out of the warehouse, running down the stairs to the restaurant like schoolchildren escaping a classroom. The restaurant was a modest, unassuming local tavern, but the kitchen was legendary. And the star piece of the feast was a highly celebrated traditional regional delicacy, Shengban Liu Pian Thinly, sliced raw carp. Chefs had taken a massive, glistening, freshly caught carp straight from the freezing waters of the Songhua River. With master-level knife skills, they sliced the translucent white flesh into paper-thin ribbons, arranging them beautifully on a massive wooden platter, garnished with a secret powerful house sauce, made of aged black vinegar, crushed garlic, fiery chili oil, and wild mountain herbs. To understand why these Japanese officers went completely insane for this dish, you have to realize that they had been stationed in the deep, landlocked, muddy interior of continental Asia for years. They were profoundly homesick, desperately craving the clean, delicate taste of raw fish, the sashimi of their homeland. The moment the massive platter hit the center of the table, General Lin Baoji completely abandoned any semblance of imperial dignity or military discipline, though he had loudly barked an order at the beginning of the meal that no one is allowed to drink heavy liquor during duty hours. He immediately began continuously pouring cups of fiery sorghum wine down his own throat. He picked up his wooden chopsticks and began violently twirling them through the air with the speed and aggression of a master swordsman swinging a katana. He lunged across the table, shoveling massive clumps of the raw, seasoned carp directly into his mouth, chewing furiously and shouting through a full mouth, "Incredible, magnificent. The texture is perfect. The sauce is a masterpiece." Within a matter of minutes, the entire giant mountain of raw fish was completely decimated, vacuumed away by the ravenous chopsticks of the Japanese command, like a locust swarm clearing a wheat field. Seeing the pure joy on the general's face, the clever Lieutenant Chow immediately signaled the kitchen to rush out a second, even the larger platter of the raw delicacy. Tomball watched the scene with deep amusement. He realized that the young lieutenant was a master of survival. By feeding the beast its favorite meal, Lieutenant Chow had completely disarmed the Imperial audit with their bellies full of premium raw fish and expensive black market wine. Major Shirai, General Lin would spend the afternoon laughing, drinking, and casually stamping every single logistics book with a passing grade, completely. Forgetting about finessing boots, it was the ultimate display of raw fish diplomacy. The winter camp inspection tour had finally concluded. Then the warship Yangmin accelerated to its maximum speed of 40 knots, rushing through the dark, freezing night back toward Harbin. Shengbao stood alone at the bow of the ship, his coat collar pulled tight against a biting, razor-sharp wind, and looked down at the dark water and noticed a thin, translucent layer of brittle ice forming along the riverbanks. The river was advisedly thought freezing over the shipping season was ending, and a long, brutal winter was settling over the empire. When the flagship finally docked at the Harbin Central Piers, the political transformation of the base was complete. The old copper plaque of the River Defense Fleet was permanently gone, replaced by the heavy wooden sign of the River Army. A new, notoriously ruthless commander, General Cao Bingson, was arriving to take absolute control of the base, forcing the units into rigid land army. That configurations, our old, colorful, opium-addicted commander, Admiral Yin the Bearded, was officially pushed into a secondary advisory role. True to his deeply superstitious nature, the old warlord refused to leave the base on an inauspicious calendar date, choosing instead to lock himself inside his office and sleep for 3 days straight. Cheng Bao picked up his small leather suitcase, tucked the legendary notched ancient Japanese katana safely under his arm, and walked through the front doors of his family home. But the moment he pushed open the door and saw his elderly father sitting at the wooden table, staring blankly at a completely empty bottle of that cheap liquor, his heart shattered with a profound, bitter sadness, he realized that despite his high official rank, his beautiful wool uniform, and his pockets full of silver bribes, he was still just a powerless boy, unable to protect the people he loved from the slow, crushing decay of the occupation. The next morning, Cheng Bao grabbed 2 massive empty ceramic jugs and walked down the snowy avenue toward the notorious Zhengsheng distillery to buy his father a drink. But he had no idea that this simple errand was about to ignite a catastrophic, violent feud. He was about to cross paths with a corrupt, arrogant shopkeeper who would deliver a brutal, humiliating slap across his face, triggering a high-stakes, brilliant plot for revenge that would rock the city's underworld. What happens when a translator stops talking and starts fighting back? Find out in Chapter 8. Thank you for listening to Orient Shadows Archive. If you're ready to witness the ultimate showdown on the frozen death streets of Harbin, make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave us a 5-star review, and share this episode with a friend. Until next time, keep searching the shadows